thought I was going to bring you all up one at a time. You guys kind of defeated me on that.
Didn't know.
So, right down here. And we seem to be missing our AFWorks. Is AFWorks here, our AFWorks panelist? Perhaps he didn't make it. Must have had something come up, didn't receive anything. Are these things on?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Well, I'll let everybody, let's start from, I think we kind of got this. I was thinking about this. Remember in middle school when we'd go to a middle school dance and it was always boy, girl, boy, girl? I wanted it public, private, public, private. We're kind of close. So let's start at the end and I'll let each of you introduce yourself and give a 15, 20-second overview. Kevin?
Hi, is this on?
Yep. Yeah.
I'm Kevin Beaty. I have a small e-mobility consulting practice. We work almost exclusively with commercial vehicle OEMs, their tier ones, in some cases startups that are bringing new propulsion or new smart mobility technology to the market. And we work a fair bit with fleets as well, doing VOC work to help those OEMs and tier ones get new product, new technology into the market.
Hi everyone, I'm JonMichael. I am the assistant director, or one of the assistant directors at the city's transportation department, City of Austin. The guy that Mayor Adler was pointing to was me. So I run the Smart Mobility Office, which is a smart city office of sorts, and we work at the intersection of people and the rest of their lives and their mobility constructs throughout their days.
Hi, I'm Yusuf Mehta, professor in the Department of Civil Engineering and director of Create Center.
Hi, Kevin Rustagi, director of business development at Lift Aircraft. We make an ultralight aircraft. It's basically a drone that you can sit in. We can teach any of you to fly in about half an hour.
There's your pitch. Darren Anderson, Director of Strategy and Innovation for the Texas Department of Transportation. And as a part of my duties, I'm responsible for emerging technologies and their impact on mobility and understanding where that plays in the department's mission as well as for the state.
Excellent. Bill Marsh here. And AJ, could I ask you a favor of putting up my first slide? I wanted to provide a little context here because this panel has been an evolution over the years. And first slide, AJ. There we go. So I think, Yusuf, you're probably the person who would most appreciate this. When we started this journey in 2020, the theme, looking for a theme, was around, a transportation, mobility, as an element of transportation, as a network. And the question I asked of the panel at that time is, why don't we have a, if communications is a network moving bits and bytes, and transportation is a network moving goods and people, why don't we manage transportation networks like we do communication networks? Communication networks work very well from personal area to micro to local area to wide area, and we don't do that very well in terms of coordination. So I mapped that to the OSI model. That was the 220 story. Let's go to the next one, AJ. In 2021, and I couldn't find anything better to explain this than the three-dimensional chess that Spock used to play, right? Of course, everybody knows how to play that, right? And the whole point there was we think of transportation in only one dimension, surface. We don't think about, in that last year we talked about, above the surface, right? But this year we're also going to talk about below the surface, since that's become very interesting, sort of subterranean, surface, and air. And now to 2022, if you go one more, I don't know what our theme is for today. I have to be perfectly honest with you. In working through this, I wasn't sure, so we're going to let this kind of free flow here. And sort of the first question I want to look here that I want to ask is talk about public versus private versus public plus private in partnering. And when should public lead? When should the public be side by side? When should the public follow? And when should the public get out of the way? And I'm going to go, because my good friend Darren here is right next to me, I'm going to ask Darren to sort of respond to that first in terms of, when public, when private.
So I'd say in delivering what we do, there's very few cases where there's one or the other. I think it's just degree of spectrum of that. So, so although they may not be called public-private partnerships, in delivery of construction projects, there's obviously quite a bit that's done by contract elements in the state. And I guess, when should we get out of the way? So I don't know that, some of them we lead on design maybe.
Okay.
Although we have a heavy contingent of engineering consultants that do design work in the state as well. The majority of our new construction projects, I would say, are done by contracts. Yep. But our maintenance ones, I think there's more of a 50-50 there, especially small projects. And then getting out of the way is when innovation is happening, right? And we don't really make the laws, but we can advise on the pros and cons of what's happening regarding emerging technology and what that means for mobility, and let the legislature decide what kind of, if any, legislation they want to pass. Typically in our state it's to facilitate that, and I think they've done a pretty, not only admirable but aggressive effort in the last 7 to 8 years to enable autonomy, to enable urban air mobility and smaller.
So that's the get out of the way part.
So that's the get out of the way piece, is
Okay.
allow the industry to innovate.
Excellent. I'm going to jump to the end, because I'd like to hear, particularly around commercial transportation. Kevin, if you would, respond to that as being, on the private side. I got the public side from Darren. Maybe you want to talk from the private perspective.
Sure. So, I've actually worked on several public-private partnerships through my career, typically at the national level, the 21st Century Truck Partnership, U.S. Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, EPA, and a number of others. And I'd say, rather than when, to me, it's more like when there's a common pain point, yeah, or when there's a policy imperative and there's clearly a need in the market or an opportunity, but it's just not being met by a meaningful commercial response. And so shining a spotlight on that issue and getting a discussion going, whether it's through funding or whether it's through there have been some grant or some prize money put out there for different initiatives, which really moved mountains in the industry. So that's another area. But then I agree, once the innovation starts and you see industry starting to put money in, then government can back away, mission accomplished, and things are moving forward. I'll just mention driver shortage, for example.
Okay.
We have a chronic, really an epidemic in this country around driver shortage. It affects last mile delivery, but it also affects over-the-road trucking. It has been in existence for more than 20, 30 years, and we have never really improved on it. The pandemic has made that only worse. And so, I would love to see some public-private discussion and focal point, because we've got more and more technology available to come to bear, but really coming at it from a driver shortage perspective has been a miss from my perspective.
Interesting. Kevin 2. I'll call Kevin 1, Kevin 2.
I'm the second.
You're the, well, he's the public. Well, no, you're both private. I'm sorry. Anyhow, Kevin.
Age
Kevin
before
2,
beauty.
Kevin the younger, Kevin the elder. Anyhow, from your perspective, you kind of have a unique perspective, because you're functioning in a relatively new dimension. I mean, we understand 5,000 feet and above. That's very well managed by the FAA, et cetera. You're operating below that space generally. How do you view, a public interaction with that? Do they get in your way? Are they assisting? How do you look at it from a municipal, an unincorporated county, state, and federal level?
It's a great question. We operate, generally speaking, for our recreational use case in class golf airspace. It's below 1,200 feet, but it's a fair point of breaking up the airspace. you know, I exist in this really bizarre industry where there are companies and private organizations that are going for what's called a certified aircraft that demonstrates a 1 in a billion chance of a fatal incident, which is incredible, right? So commercial aviation has done that. If I woke up on an alien planet and you told me that commercial aviation was 1,000 to 10,000 times safer than walking across the street, I would laugh. I would say, that's crazy. It's a system. It's got all these different moving parts. And yet that, aside from, of course, the 737 MAX, is the case, which is super tragic. On the other hand, what we're doing at Lyft is really saying, let's start flying in a very limited use case, keeping the aircraft lightweight so that we can fly actually in a space that's largely unregulated. Right. The only regulation is stay below this weight and stay below this altitude and stay away from congested areas. And you can do whatever you want.
Speed, no speed limitation?
There is a speed limitation, yes, of 55 or 62 miles an hour, 55 knots.
Okay.
So it basically, if you're only risking yourself as the pilot,
Yes.
You are allowed, and you can do this already today. You could build one of these aircraft in your backyard and go fly it, and people do. Not to the level, I would argue, of safety that we're focusing on. So it's kind of an interesting situation where actually government has gotten out of the way.
Yeah.
And they've said, let's instantiate this ultralight class of aircraft. I think the fear, or what I would argue for, is actually government saying, here's a sandbox in which you can operate and instantiate that into the future. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
There's no right answer. It's okay. This is like law school. There's no right answer. It's all how you answer. So now I'm going to go to my friend with 3 first names, Jason JonMichael. And I'm going to, and we had an interesting discussion right before we started this panel where he goes, you know, we can't get surface transportation, which we've been doing for 120 years, organized. How the heck are we going to do it in this, now we know, 0 to 1,200 foot zone? Why don't you comment on that, and you know, what role a public entity like the City of Austin or the Transportation Department would have on that, given that you can't control the, you know, going from cars to buses to scooters today?
Yeah, and you know, Darren and I, you know, we share a unique responsibility as public agencies of maintaining the public land, right? It's all of our land, it's what we pay for, and it's for all of us. And so when you say that out loud, it sounds great. When you then have to put it into operational action, it takes a lot of people and a whole lot of policy, a lot of framework, right? You know, folks take for granted what it takes to actually go around and develop a transportation criteria manual, right? A transportation criteria manual is what gives engineers in that locality an understanding of what specific characteristics need to go into their engineering designs for that community. Say for Austin, it's very different than Minnesota, just due to our weather, right? So using that as an example, that's where everything lies today. What we're seeing happen in ground mobility is a change that we just started, right? We just started to see a change since 2018 of really balancing that car-dominant environment, right? Because people are finding new and innovative ways to get around. And we want them to do that. We want to find ways to make sure that the built environment helps support what choices people want to use. It's not our jobs to decide what mobility choices people use. It's our jobs to make sure that we build an environment that can accommodate anything that's coming in, and that we find ways to balance that to meet certain policy goals or needs. One of those policy goals in Austin, this espoused in our Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, which is this, it's got about 120 policies in it. It's a good 30-year horizon document. One of those is for us to be at a 50-50 modal split by 2039. That means that right now, 74% of Austinites that commute to work downtown take a single occupant vehicle. They drive themselves, drive alone. We want to change that by 2039, and that'd be 50-50. That means taking 26% of people that drive alone and moving them over into some other mode of transportation other than the first thing they do is pick up their keys. That sounds great on paper, then when you think about putting it into action, right, how much do we get generationally speaking with each generational shift of more and more people deciding to leave their cars, right? That comes down to how we change policy. So where cities come in and where public policy comes into play is what setting that goal set, right? A lot of us, we're talking around transportation, ITS was mentioned earlier, so, you know, think about the great pivot that we all talk about, right, with IIJA. You know, we thought that we were at the cusp of hitting the plateau of productivity for connected and autonomous vehicle. And then with one fell swoop of Biden's pen, we pivoted all to electric vehicle enablement. So I think it showcases that government policy has a very direct responsibility, right? Accountability to setting those into action. And then the accountability part is making sure that people use that money the way that we intended it to be used.
So sort of building off of that, I want to come to you, Yusuf, and ask a question about you know, this whole multimodal transport thing and really leapfrogging. I want to think a little bit about leapfrogging. The concept came up a couple times earlier today about, you know, skipping one generation of technology and simply going to the next. And an example I would give, and I'm going to put it on Austin, but I want you to respond first. It's okay to call you, should I say Herr Professor or Yusuf? Okay. On this whole, you know, leapfrogging concept, and the whole concept of building more public transportation, which is very efficient at moving people along what I will call fixed thick routes, versus, and I'm going to steal a term from somebody gave me earlier today, what I tend to think of a mesh network of a bunch of individual transportation elements all moving around, what somebody called the swarm. Not even a mesh, the swarm network. You know, how do we address that? Given as Jason has said, we can't even manage what we're doing today. The relatively simplistic.
Hey, wait a second. That's not what I said.
So transitioning from a fixed point movement to making a mesh, it's more of a policy decision, and also when we were looking at, for example, the first and last mile, how people can pay for these services, right?
Yes.
So it is not an engineering problem, it's more of a policy problem, as you mentioned, and how we can make it cost effective. So I think that will require a change in culture from the bottom up. So that's what.
Okay. I'm going to go to a different, and this is specific to you, Darren. You're dreading, this isn't the question you were expecting. I'm setting you up before that one. That one will come later. But as the term infrastructure sort of evolves, you know, let's be honest, you know, TxDOT manages, you know, state roads and in many ways is the coordinator across the state of county and municipal activity as well. You know, to you, infrastructure has traditionally meant dirt and asphalt. Okay, I'm simplifying a little bit. And as we discussed, you're now being made responsible for communications, and most recently, electrification. And you know, as you discussed, this whole electrification has been a challenge for TxDOT in that you now have to communicate with somebody other than just the DMV, the legislature, and the governor. You now have to interact with utilities, both public and private, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about that journey that you're going through as this definition of transportation infrastructure expands?
And I'd tie it to communications too. I mean, because I think the last time we met, talked a lot about digital infrastructure and how I saw that as really a key component of enabling mobility in the future, and other services, other government services, as well as the public need, and that includes, you know, low-level flight as well. So the challenge is, yeah, I mean, we interact with other state agencies and with telecoms, for example, and utilities, certainly in right-of-way clearance, but not in terms of what they deliver and how they deliver has to work with what we're now responsible for delivering. And I think that's that's a pretty big shift for some of us in our thinking in terms of now, at least initially, we're responsible for delivering some electric vehicle charging infrastructure to augment what's already out there and to kickstart connectivity and address range anxiety across the state. And so now we have to learn what all the electric providers in the state are, where they are, what they do, who owns what piece of ground, and all their challenges and what their aspirations are as well, because something I don't think we anticipated is that some of them may want to get into the business of delivering electric vehicle charging.
Right.
And they may already be, but we didn't really have that awareness. And then how does that relate to communications infrastructure and what communications needs are? And so it's a much more systems to systems and a multi-agency responsibility or at least oversight commitment than what we have done, traditionally.
So your job's gotten more interesting.
For me, it has, yes.
That's good. So, since we're on charging infrastructure, I'm gonna pivot. I apologize. Everybody will get a chance here, but I'm coming back to you, the man with three names, three first names. That's what I'm going to call you from now on, the man with three first names.
Jason is my middle name, by the way.
Oh. You have another first?
Yeah, my full name is Michael Jason JonMichael. Just throwing that out there.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about, since we're talking about charging infrastructure and this interaction, and that, presumably in your plan, you have a goal of vehicle electrification penetration of a certain percent. Yet 3 weeks ago, there's at least one person in this audience who has a electric vehicle, a very fancy one with an English, very fancy English vehicle that, you'd never think of as an electric vehicle, and was relying exclusively on Austin Energy for their vehicle electrification, their DC fast charging sites that got turned off during a critical power peak load period, where Austin Energy decided, well, the first things we're going to turn off will not be Samsung and the semiconductor plant, won't be everybody's air conditioning. Oh, we'll just cut off all the DC fast chargers. How does that, how does the city, and the city owns, am I correct, it's fair to say owns Austin Energy, right? It owns Austin Energy, yet they went and did this against your plan. You were kind of at the bottom of the pecking order relative to load priority. How do you respond to that?
So first, I want to carry off of what Darren said, which is the biggest thing happening in transportation is that we're beginning to orient around the customer for the very first time. We've been looking at everyone that uses our transportation system as a transportation user for quite some time. There have been customers, transit customers, mobility as a service customers, but the institution as a whole, we're beginning to look at how we create individual trip journeys that give us a better understanding of how people move. Without understanding our customers, we can't build an infrastructure that supports their needs. Plain and simple, right? And so one of the biggest institutional shifts that's happening, you got to remember this is an institution that's been living and engineering an asset a certain way for the betterment of 70 years, is going to want to quickly try to pivot towards a customer-centric model, right? That's what everything that's happening, mobility as a service, scooters, electrification, you name it, it's about us and our phones, right? It's about us and how we connect to things. So that is part and parcel to everything else that's going on, right? So to your exact pointed question, first I will say that I am not an Austin Energy spokesperson, so therefore everything I'm saying could be wrong. It's not necessarily a wholly owned subsidiary of the city of Austin. It just so happens that it does have a very unique regulatory landscape in the Central Texas region, namely within the full-purpose district of the city of Austin. And you pointed out something that's happening right now. We talk around, in most of the conferences that I'm going to, we're talking around what we're hoping to experience 50 years from now, not what we're experiencing today. And that's the journey. Bill, we were Gavin, we were talking around, other initiatives like rural broadband that's now taken 16 years and 3 presidents to try to continue to get that done.
Yep.
And we still have the law of incremental improvement proving to us that it's going to be a little bit longer, right? What I say is that, the Austin Energy thing, that's because right now, DC fasts, the amount of them in town versus the level 2s and other things is vastly different. And you're seeing where electrification is in a very, very stacked pecking order of needs for electrification in any community.
Yeah, but you're at the bottom. You got put at the bottom of the list. Let's be blunt about that, right? The first thing to be cut off by Austin Energy during a peak load period and on a hot summer day was DC fast chargers.
Sure. And is that bad? Well,
I'm asking you how. I would actually ask people in the audience who were cut off by that how they felt about that, and if I can give them your number.
I'll give them one of my friends over at Austin Energy that electrifies. But
Wait.
Can I bail him out?
Sure.
So the answer to your question is that Austin Energy had no choice. ERCOT mandated a certain peak load to be cut, and there's a ranking of priorities, and EV charging doesn't have a human being attached to it.
Yeah.
So they're public stations, so they're in the first list of guys cut off.
Yeah.
But Austin Energy doesn't make that decision, it's ERCOT who makes that decision.
He bailed you out.
Thank you, Andres. Well, and I think what I'm probably espousing really pretty well here is the fact that just in the transportation industry, we have a lot to learn around electrification. We have a lot. Like the very first time I decided that I wanted to go talk to Austin Energy about electrifying a curb, it happened to be out in front of Google, right? Because we wanted to do an actual scooter dock that was connected to the grid. The amount of things that I learned that I was unaware of about how cities actually electrify themselves. We put it on the backs of a lot of the developers today, right? Now I need to go ask every one of those building owners for electricity? That doesn't work scale-wise,
Yep.
right? So these are the things that we are now going to be discovering. It's not like we're going to electrify America. You're going to watch us go through and get a lot of bruises and bumps as we electrify America.
Okay. Good recovery. You can pay Andreas later
Yes.
for
It's coming in the
that's
mail,
at least
Andres.
one beer. So now Kevin 1, Elder Kevin. That's okay, right?
Kevin the Wise.
Kevin the Wise. That sounds better. Kevin the Wise. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin the Beautiful.
Sage.
Young
Coming
grasshopper.
back to you, and relative to Jason, JonMichael, and Darren, what can they do to support what your commercial transportation, automation, and electrification initiatives? How do you work with again, kind of back to the public-private piece? How do you work from them? What would be your asks of them? You've got them on this panel. Ask that question.
So if Jason JonMichael doesn't represent Austin Energy, I definitely don't represent the commercial vehicle smart mobility industry by any stretch. I will say Texas clearly has taken a step to open the doors for autonomous vehicle testing, on-the-road testing and demonstration.
And that's the legislature, right? With the help of TxDOT.
I think so, yeah. So that's a policy issue, but it's kind of opened the door, and so you do see a lot of technology firms working with the OEMs, setting up shop and operations here in Texas, which is good. I think the last mile delivery piece is a lot more complex, and I can't even imagine what some of the sticking points are, so nothing just comes to mind right away.
Okay. Fair, that's okay answer. And now I want to go to Kevin the younger. The less wise just doesn't sound right. I apologize. So I'll say Kevin the younger. What about to you, from you to Jason JonMichael and to Darren, about what can they do to help or get out of the way relative to 0 to 1,200 feet as you described it? The space you operate in, you want to operate in.
There's a tremendous opportunity to engage in that space. So I explained, for our commercial use case, we're allowing members of the public to come and fly with us, do recreational beginner flights where you are the pilot and you learn how to fly. But again, those are in a small sandbox out and away from congested areas. What's already legal today as well are first responders and public safety officials using our aircraft to fly over cities. And it's something I'm incredibly excited about. And I have to say, you know, there are certain states leaning in, trying to have urban air mobility. Companies like Lyft come in and they're hosting, you know, conferences and trying to bring us in, states like Ohio and Massachusetts. And there's a tremendous opportunity to engage on that front. No one has had their life saved yet with an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, and we aim to be the first to do that.
Okay, well, I want to give a follow-on to that, given what you've discussed. And, you know, I know Darren's immediately going to say, he's going to do the disclaimer, I don't represent them. But, you know, above 1,200 feet, if that's that delineation, demarcation point, that's part of the education here, is everybody has a little bit different knowledge and perspective. If that certification or licensing is done by the FCC, who should be or should there even be a licensing? I mean, I don't need a license to ride a bicycle, but I need a license to drive a car. Should the Texas DMV, which Darren's going to be a spokesman for here in this case, who should be, or should anybody be licensing you? Oh, wait, let Darren. Darren wants to respond.
So first, FAA first, not FCC. I think you were going to say
Did I say
that.
FCC?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, FAA.
No, the DMV shouldn't be involved in licensing any drones.
Not going to do it.
Yeah, not going to do it. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions with the FAA because the state has directed an urban air mobility advisory committee to review the state's laws and think through, are there any impediments? Are there any laws that need to be added to facilitate the development of the industry? And that's everything from small package delivery all the way to light aircraft to ultimately 4-passenger, you know, basically helicopter equivalents in large packages. So we're working with the FAA and we're trying to understand what their long-term vision. Right now, they own everything from the ground up. Yeah. I mean, just period. And they have different, as he described, different areas of operation, have different requirements. Certainly, commercial aircraft that most of us are familiar with is much more controlled and restricted. And then as you go down in scale to private aircraft, it's a much more wide open environment right now. They know that with the advent of hundreds and thousands of drones in airspace, that's going to become at some point an issue for people. Maybe not an issue for the pilots or for the automated systems, but it's going to be an issue for the public to be able to feel comfortable with. And so they know that they've got to work on that. They know that they've got to work with the states and the cities on their components. And the states and cities do set certain restrictions on the ground that may influence the airspace. But working through all those and working that with industry as well to figure things. But right now, I mean, they've got time. I mean, the reality is they have some time. It may not feel like that when you see a
Kevin, do you
drone delivery and you know, and you see some stuff going on in some cities in Texas. But the reality is those are the very first companies that have authorities to go beyond visual line of sight and have more open operations. And his is probably the most open that I can think of. And so it just depends. But they're learning from each of those companies and each of those authorized use cases what they want to do next in terms of controlling airspace or not controlling it.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'm going to come to you, Yusuf, because you're hair professor. I like hair professor. I'm going to give everybody names now. I haven't figured out one for you yet, Darren, but I'm going to, you have a nickname?
Just me.
Just me. But Yusuf, you were focused on, you know, I said the three-dimensional view of the world of transportation, subterranean, surface, air. You are focused on air at surface at this point. What learning can come from that relative to the multimodal, et cetera, that you believe is directly applicable either above ground or below ground?
Even though I'm in construction materials and payments, I don't believe we can construct our way through transportation. You need to have a comprehensive strategy. I think on my end, I think if we can do a little bit to just extend the life of the payment and just before we go out and add one more lane, just think whether there are other ways of providing the same service to different modes. That's the right way to do it. So that's, yeah.
Okay. Well, extending on that a little bit, you know, I was recently in Europe for a period of time, and it's amazing how much traffic, you know, how many bits, the equivalent of bits and bytes, Europe and particularly Germany can get on their roadways. What they can put on a 2-lane, a 4-lane highway, we need a 16-lane Katy highway in Houston to carry the same amount of traffic. How do we solve that problem? How do we, short of autonomy, which comes a little later, can we solve that problem now? Are there anything short of level 5 autonomy that we can do to make so we can pack more bits and bytes on that pavement?
Are you talking about more vehicles?
Yeah, more vehicles.
Okay. One way we are dealing with this in connected and automated vehicles is, yeah, if you can get more vehicles to go in with less headway between them,
correct,
you will have less drag, more fuel efficiency, but you'll also have more damage, right? You're going to have channelized traffic. That's going to create another problem that was not there before. So all of these issues are going to come once you get connected vehicles coming in on the roadways, on the infrastructure side.
Okay. By the way, I wrote this down from your talk. You mentioned jaywalking and working on jaywalking. I will confess I've actually been cited. I actually have had a citation in Westwood, California for that. And not only that, but I have also been cited in El Segundo, California, both for speeding and running a stop sign on a bicycle. So
I want to jump in, Bill, with the European German.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I do is I do most of my work is around human behavioral shift, right? The technology is just there, and it's the thing that people, it's the shiny object that people like and they adopt, right? But really it's around human behavioral shift, not even change, shifting, right? Because we're all human. I want to lose weight, but I have to shift it, right? I can't do it all at once. It never works. That's the reason we always have our New Year's resolutions. When you think about other cultures and their driving culture, they're very different, right? I mean, think about Germany, for instance, and when you can become a licensed driver. The amount of training that has to be done in state-sponsored versus what do we do here? Raise your hand if you have kids. Keep your hands up if they're over 16. Did you parent teach your kid?
Yes.
Driver training. Keep your hands up if you followed every single thing and logged every single hour. Right. Only a few. Right? And most of us that are in the transportation world to begin with. What if I were to tell you that my good friends at NHTSA, they have some really unique information. For instance, a driver between the ages of 16 and 21 are 9 times more likely per mile driven to be in a crash, right? Of that group, right, 60% more likely to be in a fatal or critical injury, right? Then you go and look at what's happening out in the real world. Look at where we are with our fatalities after the pandemic. Because why? We allowed human behavior to go unregulated, to go unenforced. And what is the number one cause of now the 42,000 deaths per year? We're back to a Boeing 747 falling out of the sky again, every day. If a 747 fell out of the sky every day, it'd only take a couple of days before the American public would demand a response, right?
Yeah, it's normal.
But that is the difference between air travel and ground travel, right? Yeah. That is the main difference between the two. One is more of a secured utility of travel, and the other one is kind of a free-for-all, right? Let's be honest. So when it comes down to driver behavior, it's critically important that you can create a culture. That culture is a different between where in the United States we are The difference in Europe is because we have a level of state sovereignty here, which allows a different look and feel as you move it from state to state.
Yeah.
Right? That ultimately creates a differentiation in the types of drivers out there. And they don't just stay in their state and live in that, right? So where we need to go with this is the same thing that we're seeing with scooters, right? We were at a point where everybody out there understood how to ride a scooter and how to do it properly. And we were seeing the crashes go down. We only had one fatality. Post-pandemic, I've had 3, and people are behaving badly again and throwing scooters in the river. Human behavior and the ability to maintain it is something that we in the United States need to figure out how to do, and do our way. Not the way the Europeans do it, not the way the Asians do it, but figure out how to do it the way that, like Kevin and I were talking around. To make these changes happen, it takes a lot. One of the questions to Kevin earlier that I wanted to comment on was around last mile.
Yep.
There are several cities on the seaboards that are doing that. Seattle, LA, DC, and they're all trying different, electric vehicle, like bring back the UPS bicycle,
right.
cargo bike, right? But make it electric. What they're seeing is a big lack of adoption from the businesses, right? And so we're not seeing those programs launch yet, but everybody talks about them like that's a done deal. No, it's not done. We got a lot of work to do in actually seeing these things enter to the market and continue to operate. Austin is the only city in the United States, maybe even the world still today, that has an open marketplace for scooters. I work for the city of Austin that loves to regulate stuff, as Steve said. Okay? How did I convince culturally inside the city for us to not overregulate scooters? Because there was more to come, right? Stand-up two wheels were meant to get SOV drivers out of their cars.
Yeah.
We're immediately supposed to be supplying them with a lot of electric low-speed vehicles that were supposed to be coming back then, but they're not, but they are beginning to come now thanks to IIJA. And again, the clarity of what we want to buy. Right now, I can tell you, I saw a list at a different conference 2 weeks ago. 480 electric vehicles entering the market in the next 10 years. 80% of those are under 3,500 pounds. And of that 80% under 3,500 pounds, half of them are in the air.
Half of them
Are in the air.
Yeah.
So that tells you where the vehicle demand is going to be on the infrastructure, right? So ultimately, if we're trying to build infrastructure that serves our private partners and our public and what the choices they want to use, we better be paying attention to what's coming to market and not look at engineering the current car-dominant infrastructure and the way and the look and feel of how a city looks today. Because the way the people are going to make different choices in the very near future, because they're going to have all these wonderful private companies trying to find ways to deliver that to them. So that's where cities get out of the way.
I would add on to that, actually. So I'm a cyclist. Who here rides a bicycle more than a few miles once a week? A few people, right? I ride a bicycle in Austin, and it is terrifying. If you're not outside of a few prescribed lanes, I would, ask and really provide, getting people out of their cars. You look at Europe and the car culture there. The way they got people out of their cars in Paris is by building an incredible rail system, by making the city walkable, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't done that as much here. I'm excited about the Blue Line and the Orange Line, of course.
Sure. Well, and a lot of folks like to compare us to either northern cities or cities on the seaboards where the United States started 150 years ago, right? And don't think about the agrarian society or the post-agrarian society. So I call it the pizza pie analogy of post-Civil War agrarian society, right? And that's what we are in Austin. That's what everything south of the Mason-Dixon line is for the most part. We don't have city grids, right? We don't have the ability to have had a 50 years worth of density to really promulgate, a mass transit system. Instead, what we have is this pizza pie analogy, right? And it's like we got a tiny little city center, right? That's like the plastic thing that keeps the cheese off the cardboard. And then radiating lines that went out to the farms. That's where you cut the pizza. Then we filled up the actual pizza pie with a bunch of neighborhoods with squiggly little roads that a 40-foot bus can't even turn in. And that's what we have. across most of the south of the United States. And that's our challenge. And what you're seeing happen in Austin is a very progressive, go forward and get a lot of bruises, because that's our plan, is to try to densify. You've seen us do code next and fail. You've seen us do code next and fail. We're using a transit initiative right now to try to build transit-oriented development that will provide some of that density, right, and provide efficiencies for people. But in that fail forward that we were wanting to talk about, that's how you're seeing public policy fail forward, is for us to take on these hard losses with the understanding that we're walking away with it with a better understanding of what the people of Austin want, and ultimately a better idea of how to deliver that to them.
Well, I will tell you, as a cyclist, I'm not very happy with how many bike lanes have actually been put in. I'm gonna get some mean looks here, but they, the flip side of that is they create additional vehicular friction and create congestion and other things. And there's kind of a balancing there. And this is as a cyclist. I know I don't look like it, but not like younger Kevin. But yes, I do cycle a lot. So, I want to. I want to keep going on this point, but there are a couple other things I know we want to bring up, and one of them I want to talk about, and I'll start down at the end with Kevin, since you kind of opened this door a little bit on workforce development, and specifically as you talk about commercial transport, commercial goods transport, if I'm sort of breaking it down, those are the kind of bytes we're moving on the network. I'd like each of you to kind of respond to, what are the specific workforce development challenges that you see? We'll go right down the road.
Hadn't really thought about this question, but first thing that comes to my mind is vocational tech-based training. We need technicians that can turn wrenches and diagnose problems at the system level on new technology. We need it for today's technology, which is very complex. If you think about an advanced diesel with after treatment and everything else, that's no simple matter. Some of you, the passenger cars you drove in today, you know this, you've got over 100 microprocessors on board, over 1 million lines of software code on board. And much of this is around the propulsion system. It's not like our laptops. If it crashes, we just reboot. That's not an option out on I-35 if you're doing the full speed limit or high-speed maneuvers. It's got to be reliable and safe. So just the technician, what are we doing to build up a pipeline of jobs and skills for folks that have a path that's aspirational, that's compelling, that captures people's imagination without it going off to, pedigreed university and postgrad. It's hard to get somebody with master's degree to go into the service bay and do important work to keep our vehicles on the road. So that has a lot of analogs into onboard capability, driving a package delivery truck and interacting with a lot of new technology that's coming on board. So I just think we've got some real gaps in our educational system. I would start there around the vocational piece.
What about from a municipal city level? What are the workforce development issues you're missing in the smart transportation sector?
So my answer is going to be somewhat focused through the lens of what my office does, that Smart Mobility office. And so, there we're really focused on that human change. And I would say that if you can understand and be successful with human adoption, with that comes the workforce and vice versa. Like, if you're building a multi-generational program that involves youth and the elderly, especially if you're doing autonomy, right? I mean, yeah. And there's the secret sauce, right? So finding ways to educate, an entire multi-generational family, like just take an Austin household as an example, would be one way of looking at how to build workforce. What you'll find in the work that we've done is that all the right elements are there, but not the right orientation of leaders, and policymakers, and ultimately, because we're talking about vocational schools and trying to bring a somewhat hammer and wrench-based demographic of technicians along a little bit further. I mean, what a lot of folks don't know is that our community colleges is where most of the ASCE technicians get trained. And Austin has this wonderful Austin Community College program where this is happening. That's where they're currently understanding how to hold both a computer and a wrench, right? In the future, they're going to be mostly holding a computer because a robot's going to be holding the wrench, right? Or something else. And so I say that if it's not multi-generational, then you're not looking at the full picture. And then find a way to create experiential learning. So that thing about the young drivers and 9 times more likely, why is that the case? It's hours behind the wheel. That's what it comes down to. Simple hours behind the wheel. Yeah. So find a way to create built environments. Like one of the things Austin's looking to do through our Vision Zero program is to create what we call a safety city. It's a 5/8 scale version of the city, small traffic lights and everything for small humans to get used to before they go out into the big world, right? Yeah. So we can educate them at that age, right? It's no different than smoking cessation. If we want people to stop getting in ICE cars, it's a simple way to do it. It's already been proven. We just got to get started with it.
Okay, thank you. So Yusuf, you talked a lot actually about workforce development at a particular level, I'll call it a high functional level. Do you want to expand on that, or would you like to,
Yeah, one thing I would like to add is that what we hear from the advisory boards and looking at the smart technologies, our curriculum has not evolved to take these challenges on, and that supports some of the points you made, that we are still civil engineering is traditionally siloed, and we need to rethink the whole curriculum right at the later stages of the junior year and the senior year, so they are ready for these new technologies that's coming up. We do have at Rowan experiential, we call it a clinic system, but also the projects have to support that, and the students have to be ready to take on these projects. So those are real challenges that we are going to face in the next 5 years.
So, Kevin, I'm going to rather than just let you loose on that, I'm going to put it in a little context. I'm curious about relative to the FAA, not the FCC. Thanks for correcting me. I'll get you back for that, by the way. It's coming. The FAA has very strict certifications, controls, and a workforce that in many ways constrains, in particular, private aviation. There just aren't that many certified private aviation techs, et cetera. When we move into this drone space, where we're going to have these drones flying over houses that can fall out of the air and potentially kill somebody, okay? How are we going to handle, workforce development with that? Both with yours, which is human transport, and goods transport.
Yeah, so maintenance is incredibly important. The folks at the FAA, I would kind of frame it, the FAA is not, my understanding is that they're not there to support, though they've been, doing actually a pretty good job of it, the aviation industry. They're there to protect all of you from, aircraft falling out of the sky. That's the mission, is my understanding. System level safety is their #1 priority. So yeah, I think, there will be certifications for maintenance technicians and things like this for UAM. That makes a lot of sense. They'll be using different technologies, right? These aircraft are driven by batteries, not combustion engines, by and large. They're simpler in terms of the mechanics, but you trade a lot of that hardware risk, which is, our aircraft has 19 moving parts, 18 propellers and a joystick. That's it. The number of moving parts in a helicopter is astronomical. The number of things that could go wrong in a helicopter, or even a fixed-wing aircraft, which I fly, is pretty high. But when you trade off that hardware risk, you start looking at things like software risk. You start looking at system risk. So I think that's incredibly important. The point that I did want to touch on from workforce development has to do with inspiration. One of the stark facts I realized as I became a pilot, which you don't need to be to fly our aircraft, is that 90% of pilots in the United States are men.
Okay.
And I find that fact kind of astounding. Being a pilot has nothing to do with gender. And I think my theory, and I haven't heard anything different from this as of yet, is that it has to do with inspiration. Role models, who do you look up to? Who's a pilot? And so a lot of what we're really excited about is putting people in the aircraft, giving them a chance to fly, right? We saw what the inspiration of, the original space race did for STEM education in the United States. I think getting people in an aircraft, in an electric vertical aircraft, will allow them to really spark that new interest. We're starting with adults, but later on, ideally, we'll be getting younger.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Darren?
So I sat here and thought through, as they all answered, so I won't repeat what they said. And certainly in our department, there's burgeoning technologies across multiple aspects. So I think a little more about how technology is outpacing our ability to educate it and our ability to build deep experience. Our traditional, or at least the model I grew up with, I don't know if it was, but deep learning, long study, varied, intensive work. And I look at my son, and he couldn't even stand sitting through this conference for 10 minutes. And this is my youngest one, but their learning is all Khan's Academy and YouTube videos, and it's quick learning. And so how do we begin to, one, identify what is the basic skill set, and then if you talk just engineering, and I'm not an engineer, but if what's the basics of the discipline? What has changed in civil engineering the now versus, because even in that space, I would argue that they still teach a lot of archaic things. And they've got to transition many of their approaches to more current activities that you see out in the private industry. But then also, how do I begin to identify what is the skill base that I need to teach people that they can rapidly adapt technologies and learn one technology and a year later toss it out the window because there's a new one that does that but it's better. And how do I because I think people that grew up in my area, that's a very difficult thing to latch into, right? It's discomforting, it's disquieting, and you don't want to do it. So how do I change mentality that's how rapidly technology changes, and you've got to be able to take the new and plug it in, and even if it's done differently, how do I do that? And we've got to begin to educate that, and we've got to become comfortable as educators with that, because I don't, and I'm not going to say right or wrong, right? I hate that that's the way it is, personally. I do.
You like the old way.
I like the deeper thinking, and I think there's something's been lost because of that. But I just know that the pace, and it doesn't. You can name it's AV, it's electrification, it's drones, it's 3D design and digital,
Printing.
Digital printing. But I was thinking that what's the
VR.
word? The 3D environment.
Augmented reality. Or
Virtual reality,
virtual
augmented
reality, and all of those
yeah.
things are happening simultaneously, and it is overwhelming if you're trying to use all of those in your job and you don't have the personality to make that change, right? To make that, to be that flexible. And so I think we've got to help our students in K through 12 develop that skill set and refine it even more what they're used to. And then we have to, in older generations, recognize that they are learning differently. I mean, it is clear to me when I watch them.
Well, we have one educator on, the Hair Professor, and I'm hoping that you will, what do you think of that response? That it's generally known, people talk about these the new generation, the millennial, the Xers, the Zs, I don't know where those delineations are, learn differently. And we have to, either education adapts to them or they adapt to education.
I've been teaching at Rowan for 21 years, and I have seen that this is the age of instant gratification, right? So that this is, they consider not doing well as somebody else's problem, right? So so that is a hard pass for us to. So it's never their fault, right?
Yeah.
Something else went wrong that led them to do poorly. And that's an adjustment as a faculty member. I would rather prefer a student that is not as doesn't get grades easily, but is willing to try. Right?
Look,
They're going to do
look
better
over
than that.
this way. Look over this way.
Yeah. So that's the adjustment. I think all educators are struggling with, I'm sure.
But I mean, look, all the answers are right here, right? I mean,
Well, it's true. It's
Some of the answers.
and I have a very dystopian fear that I'm gonna wake up one day and all this is dead, right? All that doesn't work. But barring that catastrophe, they know that they can ask almost any question. The question is validity, right?
Correct.
Just because I ask this idiot box something doesn't mean I'm getting the right answer.
Well,
And so how do I know I get a valid answer? And then how do I make sure that I'm accounting for this in what people have to be educated? Because a lot of things are right here now, and they don't have to know that like we had to know.
So
I think what's beautiful here that I would add briefly is just that new things that have yet to be created are not in the phone. They're not indexed.
Right, correct.
Right. So those are things that you can't look up. You have to create.
But we just don't want folks doing the diagnostics and then releasing the lift ultralight out just because they feel like they got it right. We really need them to know that it is working. And when it falls out of the sky, we don't want them saying, "Oh, it wasn't my fault." I mean, I worked on it. It's fine.
So there's a baseline knowledge that has to be known.
That gets to the challenge here.
Yeah.
And Jason said something about the tech who's got the monitor and then the robots doing the wrench turning in. It reminded me of the term cobots, which I think is a really powerful term that I don't hear used very often. But it is the reality of us working with robots to not double, triple, but much more increase our productivity and our effectiveness and our accuracy and everything else. And to me, this is back to the challenge of the education, because we've belittled or groaned about all the jobs that left our country 20 years ago to low-cost countries. And we just wanted them to come back so bad. Please come back. Well, they've come back whether we like it or not through pandemic and the supply chain and reduced globalization. But the problem is it's not the same jobs. So those folks that were working on the manufacturing floors in the Midwest, they don't have the skills to work on an automated floor at all. So a lot of my clients and folks I work with, they're standing up new battery factories. Their number one across the board, their number one problem is I cannot find qualified people or even people who want to learn to come in here and build batteries or build electric vehicles or build electric motors. And I mean, this is a very significant problem we're facing.
My one learning from this, and I'm looking at Andreas here, is we need more millennials here. Poor Kevin, the younger, is being totally ganged up on here. And I really feel bad for him. Because I think he's the youngest person here by probably about 25 years, maybe. I think he's got. Hey.
I think
your number's low, but anyway.
I think regardless of generation, adaptability is huge, right? I think people in every generation, there have been those who are willing to adapt. Right. If you look 150 years ago, some people said the steam engine, no, that's some new technology. We're not going to deal with that. I've got this horse over here. And the steam engine came, and it was super useful, right? I mean, this is another shift that we're seeing historically. I think the bringing in an inquisitive nature, curiosity, is incredibly important to engender. And I think when people are empowered and are provided with certain tools and are told, hey, you can do this from an early age, versus, hey, math is hard, right? You look at, the work that Carol Dweck has done and Angela Duckworth on grid, super interesting, such that when you do get to that job, you're excited to learn something new.
Well, who would have thought we'd use mobility as a proxy and transportation as a proxy for talking about the education system and using it as an example? But I think it's been really good. And frankly, you're lucky, Darren. We ran out of time, so we can't talk about subterranean. Although anybody can ask him a question about that.
Yeah, please.
So now we're open for questions.
Now it's open for anybody that has questions. There were a lot of awesome topics, and I have a lot to say about that too. Where was the question? Here?
Hi, I'm Dave. You turned off my car. I'm the one. And you know, if you're looking for consumer feedback, I bought a Jaguar 2 years ago, and the plug-in everywhere program was great. We lived in Tarrytown, and I'd walk up and charge it there, and I was the only one. There was like one other Tesla that charged, and now there's 4 spots there, and there's 3 different car models, and every now and again there's no spots. And I feel like we bought into this whole electrification. We bought an electric vehicle, and when I couldn't charge the car in the middle of the day when I had appointments, all of a sudden it became not a relevant solution anymore. There's 4 level charger. There's 4 level 3 chargers at Austin High. There's 4 in Westlake. I think there's a couple downtown, but that's such a traffic nightmare. I never go down there. And then we got a property in Apache Shores, and it takes 8 hours to charge my car in a level 2 charger. So it's not a relevant solution if I'm going to have to be going to Lakeway all the time as feedback. So that's feedback. My other question, issue, comment is that this whole mobility project. I'm from Philadelphia originally, so I grew up taking trains. I lived in the suburbs and fought for surface parking to get on the train to go downtown. And I just, you know, you talk about the infrastructure. I just don't see the Austin infrastructure as supporting rail, because the other part of the swarm, you know, he stole my swarm idea. What I see is more relevant for Austin. If we're really going to be a city of the future, and if we're not going to pile a bunch of money into rail that's not going to be built here, trains that aren't going to be built in the U.S., software that's not going to be created in the U.S., and then personnel on top of it, and then train stations that are going to be overnight homeless shelters once they're built, why don't we go to a solution where we have autonomous vehicles bought by Tesla, made in America, batteries made in America, and have a swarm technology that can service everything? You know, the rail lines that I've read the proposals, those people who live in Westlake, Lakeway, you know, all the way out east, and there's nothing that brings people down from the south, Kyle, Beaty, all that stuff. I don't see it as servicing the population to get to all the locations that they need to go that are not downtown.
So first I'll say, because I'm assuming that was all directed at me. First I'll say, I'm your neighbor. So I live in Apache Shores. That's my only home. I don't have other properties, and I commute every day. It's also one of the reasons I don't own an electric vehicle, is because our grid at Apache Shores is not really capable. And if you've noticed, there's a lot more folks moving into Apache Shores, bringing their Teslas from California. So there's a major issue happening, you know, in Austin. Austin is about double the national average of electric vehicle registrations in the Travis County region. And we're already seeing the issues with that, the one that Bill decided to bring up and corner me on, and this, right? And so what you're seeing happening is the fact that the policies got out there, the adoption, just like other things that we've talked about, is happening at a faster pace than the built environment can keep up with, that planning can keep up with, because same thing happens in that built environment. Those are long-term planning horizons. They take a whole lot of money to build. And then ultimately we go to the public for those votes, right? And so the public did vote resoundingly that they wanted a mass transit system in Austin. What you're seeing happen now is, how do we build a mass transit system when we already don't have the level of density that you need to build one? And this is Field of Dreams kind of thing, right? And ultimately that is part of the initiative, right, is to understand with these first 2 alignments, there's 5 total alignments, plus a bus rapid transit system that expands out to the entire area. So it's not just the rail. I want to remind everyone that there's a a lot happening on the bus side of things. And again, you know, as it comes down to the rail plan, I think that is one mode. It doesn't mean that there's one save-all for everything. You and I, if you're out in your Apache Shores property, there's really only one option, right? And that is to, well, it involves vehicle. Let me put it that way. You can decide to drive alone. You can decide to carpool, right? I think Cap Metro stopped the line that went up to the Galleria, along with the line that went up Southwest Parkway to the AMD. So, you know, there's businesses that relied on that transit system as well that have had to find other scenarios, other solutions out there. If you remember Cap Metro's neighborhood circulator plan that came out before Project Connect, right, when it was the urban rail program, that was in essence what that was supposed to do, was to solve the pizza pie analogy and to try to pull people out by creating a circulator, several circulators that would go into the neighborhoods and help balance that. Ultimately, you're watching the city make a decision on a policy that will yield hopefully a level of density, a level of transportation efficiency and affordability for people, while trying to also still maintain the fact that we live in Texas and we have really nothing other than an ocean, the Oklahoma border, and a couple of rivers to worry about as far as sprawl goes. And so those are the characteristics that make up any city. And when you look at things and you want to compare where you live or where you're visiting to where you live or elsewhere, think about those things. Think about the things that I've mentioned today. You know, the driving culture, right? When those people start getting trained to drive, et cetera. I would love to have a solution on Mopac similar to the Bay Bridge, where everybody just picks up a ride, you know, somewhere in Leander and comes on down, right, and carpools down. These are specific things that happen in specific areas due to a cultural competency around mobility that's created in every city. And ultimately, that's what we try to change. These policies do mean that we're going through the bruises and the what-ifs, right? And so having those what-ifs are very important. Solving the issue on Mopac. We didn't talk about it, but rather than cooperative driving, coordinated driving. Taking current ADAS level 2 cars with a little bit of driver training and having everybody turn on their adaptive cruise. Right? It doesn't have to be the same model even. They're a little different. Each one of them is a little different. UT's looking to want to try to test this. You know, but you know, there's some things there, right, that are these interims, these in-betweens before we get to full autonomy swarms and AVs. I've been working in the AV field for the better part of 15 years. I can tell you exactly where the state of the technology is and what's left to learn. I've been managing, I'm the one that brought and helped bring Ford here, right? As well as the 2 AI bots that are running on Austin roads. We have 3 different autonomy services operate, 4 if you include the Walmart pilot. We have 4 autonomy services running right now and another 3 that will launch next year. So we're definitely moving forward in that area. Where we need to go is to better understand how these little reference implementations around this, that, or the other blend together into one cohesive system that will involve transit because our voters have already said that's what they want.
The other part too, I think, is the difference. My daughter lives in New York City, and I think the challenge changing behavior is that if you think about getting from A to B, it's a transportation dollar. I think so long as people have a car and an option not to get on a train, if it's cheaper to take a train, take a taxi, and take an Uber to get to work, that's kind of a transportation dollar block. And to put that on top of, you know, your existing transportation dollar, I think I don't know how we're all going to pay for it except through higher property taxes, which I'm not a fan of.
Well, we got a couple other questions.
Just maybe on a lighter note, the opportunity for electrification obviously is the only chance this planet has of reducing greenhouse gases. That first cut, which is get the transport emissions down. Then you could look at building, then you could look at agriculture. So transport, it's not an if or maybe, it's a must, right? Second thing is go to China. they're about to go, instead of 25% EV adoption, EV purchases, they're getting close to 50%. And all the buses, 98% of the buses in China are electric. So it's already a proven model, and you can buy an electric vehicle in China for $10,000. So I think the ship left the port already. So the question is, how do we address the really huge opportunity to address air quality and sustainability? And I was wondering if anybody has any comments on what are your favorite opportunities to see air quality improvement through commercial, through getting the residential vehicles and buses. You know, really, how strong are people seeing air quality improvement and that equity? And how do we get the EV infrastructure in so that we get this rapid advancement to electrification?
Me?
You want to start? Go ahead.
Well, one, I'd say that if what Jason says is continuing to be accurate, then I would argue, well, the businesses, there's a huge business opportunity there, right? I mean, the state traditionally has, and I would argue any state, has not traditionally provided fueling infrastructure for its citizens. That's a private industry, effort. And I think that most states are going to continue to look at it that way, even though you have, in the case of Austin Energy, in some places they provide it. But that's at initial scale. I think it's important to remember that that's with just a very smattering of electric vehicles that we've had for a decade now. I don't think it's sustainable with state or local government monies to build that out continuously. So and we've created, we, the citizenry, and we, the world, have created something, at least for the U.S., something different in that, because electricity has been traditionally kind of a public infrastructure. In some cases, it's privatized provision in the states, whereas the gas industry has not been. So now you've created an expectation in the public. You've now got the OEMs behind it and building out the capability, but they're coming up against a government-provided service that isn't prepared for that, because they haven't done it for that part of electric, of the need. And so now we've got to figure out who's going to step in and find that opportunity. Most likely, in my mind, the businesses will. They'll find the opportunity to deliver that infrastructure, skipping over supply chain issues and all that. But there's money to be made, and typically where there's money to be made, industry comes and finds that. And that's the one thing that America does pretty well, is identify those. You point to China, it's a totally different government, a totally different approach, and so they have very unified visions on things. You just don't have that in the U.S. You don't have that at the federal, state, city, county level. We all have competing interests in the public side as well as the private side. So we have to find a different way to enable that, and I think a lot of it is working with the cities at the ground level, the counties, in some cases the state, on what are the use cases, where's the need greatest, and why do we think that way? Because we may not be totally right either. We look at it from one lens, and others look at it a different way.
Yeah, and Darren and I partner on that aspect, so that when we do go out to meet with others, at least we're trying to carry a unified message forward. I'd say that we're seeing, and it goes back to the gentleman from Apache Shores. I'm just saying that you live there because that's what I remember. We're seeing happen is the collision of two major Matterhorns in the marketplace: utility of energy and the non-utility of transportation. A lot of people like to place the word utility on transportation, but tell me where in the transportation system is there any utility? We don't have any certified rates of what it costs, right? We don't have any guaranteed service, right? To your point, you can guarantee that electricity will be at a charging station, but you can't guarantee that you'll make it across town in time, right? So first, everybody needs to understand that transportation is not a utility. Never has been, never will be.
I mean, roads feel a lot like a utility. We all pay for them. We all enjoy them. They should work.
Well, yeah, I think you're pointing out something related to how we built the transportation system. Sure. It goes back to why. I mean, there's only probably a few people in this room that know exactly why the United States ended up in a car-dominant society. It has a lot to do with the end of World War II, and it's in the Eisenhower plan. Look in the forward. It says it right there. If the Japanese had not stopped bombing Pearl Harbor, within 2 weeks, they would have been as far as Kansas City. And we didn't have any way to move our warfighting things to defend the West Coast. So our nation's leadership had a choice, rail or highway. Rail was going to take too long and be too expensive. We had a need that was much greater than moving people around in the United States. That was actually a nice insular benefit to it. I mean, why are the interstate bridges 18 1/4 high? Because the missile batteries needed to go under them. Why do we have 60 foot of clearance on either side of an interstate? So that because the wingspan of a flying fortress back then. That's still today. The military pilots are still trained to land on interstates, right? And so that's the birth of our country. That's the birth of mobility in our country. And it's something that, unlike Denmark and other places, right, that didn't start with the automobile, started with people in their feet. We didn't. We connected our country through a highway system and through using personally owned vehicles to do that. Now as a country, we're looking to try to make a change that's going to bring out whys, right? But without the historical context, you miss out on all of the learning that's happened. Learning before my time, right? This has been taught to me by others, like Elwin and others, right? This is where it's important when we talk about workforce development and we talk about the fact, like Darren said, and my kids are the same way, you know, thanks to TikTok, you know, the human attention span's been reduced to 15 seconds. But in that, right, how do we carry forward the historical context so that we're bringing forward educated people that understand the historical context, understand what today is, so they can figure out tomorrow. If you don't understand yesterday, you can't figure out tomorrow.
There was another question.
Love the discussion. Part of my background is I did the high energy density storage roadmap for the military. I was involved in executive MCC Cemitech, and we had to create the workforce. The city did not do it for us.
That's right.
And you're seeing that today. The generational questions you're talking about, we've lost the concept that today we're in a time of lifelong learning. Yeah. And it just, it's there. But the biggest thing I want to say is that when I hear panels like this, I hear silos talking. Today we're in a time of systems of systems. The only way you're going to solve the type of problems you're talking about is to use a systems of systems approach. And I don't see that happening. One of the companies I was CEO of in Austin, we did the first public-private partnership software for TxDOT with all the P3s being developed for the toll roads. TxDOT hated it at first, but then because we could stovepipe it, they liked it. But we lost the group intelligence that way. And that's the problem we're going to have with this, is that we've got to adapt a system where systems of systems is involved to solve these complex problems. I mean, the type of problems you're discussing are more driven by chaos theory than that simple business logic we get by looking in our rearview mirror. Because we are in a time of systems today.
Yeah.
And that old domain just doesn't work.
I would go ahead and respond to that. Actually, I think you touched on a really important point, right? Systems level thinking is incredibly important. We're about to put new aircraft in the sky that have never been there before, outside of testing, outside of early flights. We're about to, you know, put new rail lines in a city and things like this, right? You know, as a company, and I would perhaps speak for the panelists too, we constantly coordinate with other groups, other companies, and not just with our own vertical in terms of production and things like that, but also groups like the Air Force. I was on a call with the Air Force 3.5 hours ago. You know, it's totally a systems problem.
Well, it's a system of systems problems, and it's not just a system, though. I've done space roadmaps. I was on Lockheed Martin Skunk Work Innovation Advisory Committee.
Okay.
And you can look and see how those things go. If you're familiar with InQtel, I was the architect of InQtel, where we tried to solve some of the nation's hardest problems. And we couldn't do it with the stovepipe thinking in there. Last point, I have to pick on you, sorry. I had to leave my neighborhood in Austin. I lived in Northwest Hill. Y'all put plastic posts up in front of my house where people could not park at my house. 2 cars going opposite direction could no longer go down my street because we had 3 lanes there. So it was the unintended consequences of what you were trying to do because you were looking at a point solution and you did not look at the impacts on the ecosystem. And that to me is the biggest challenge you have today with this type of mobility issue, is we're still caught in the systems engineering of 40 years ago. And we cannot get to the ecosystem engineering going well beyond engineers to do it today. When we formed Cemitech, we had to change the way of thinking. And we did it gradually. Yes, it slid back, but you need to do the same thing here. And it's taking it, and the way to do it is not thinking about the older generation and the young generation. There's 6 generations in the workforce at the same time today. And each of the 6 different generations learn, communicate different ways. We have, and that's again, that's a complex system of systems. We've got to take that approach or we're going to fail solving the problems with climate change. We're going to fail solving mobility if we stay in our mindset of point solutions.
And I wholeheartedly agree. Working within systems is the only way to bring around equity, in everything that we do as well. And there's been a lot of historical context of how we've not looked at how the intersection of systems to systems and the human in the middle of it, right? And so systems by themselves will create unintended consequences that yield racism and other things, right? So finding ways to ensure that we can properly manage those systems and regulate them, validate what they're doing is really important. There's some other things that you mentioned that I think are key to what's happening in the city of Austin specifically. And that is our overall pardon our dust as we learn to grow after not building 40 years worth of transportation improvement. So what a lot of folks might not know is that in the next 10 to 15 years, depending on where Project Connect ends with its current 2 alignments, we're going to be seeing roughly around $29 billion worth of transportation only improvement in Austin. And we're taking on the betterment of about that many generations worth of transportation improvement. That's from everything from an airport to Interstate 35 to the aforementioned Project Connect and a bunch of other small road projects that are going on. So add into that the amount of development that's happening in Austin, and what you find yourself in is the need for these system-to-systems approaches, because without them, how are we supposed to get good information to people out there so they can understand how to move around the city? So I would say that the natural systems will yield some better system-to-systems approaches in the near future, just to the fact of what's been voted on and what's now in the hopper of projects that are coming down.
I'd like to add, you were mentioning Cemitech, right? That you were involved with Cemitech. I want to put a challenge back to you, given that you're in the semiconductor space and we're talking about not being, we're in the semiconductor space. I saw a little shake of the head there. But I want to come back to this verification point that you're making and that everybody seems to be, focused on, that we need to do verification. What's really interesting, you want to do some, cross-industry, cross-technology, cross-functional learning. Look at how verification has evolved in the semiconductor industry. Prior to about 95 to 97, verification was done whole and complete. You tested every transistor, you tested every possible input, every possible output on a design. About 95, 96, 97, the transistor count, particularly in CPUs, 94? Around 94, the whole CPU, we could no longer test a CPU like a state machine, every input, every output. We had to do some other kind of verification modeling. And so I kind of challenge you, you talk about, don't point out the problem, give us a solution. take that learning from the semiconductor industry and apply it to the transportation and mobility industry relative to solving this verification problem.
Yeah, can somebody remind me, because Cemitech's been brought up a number of times to me, and obviously it was before my time at the city, so I don't know that much about it other than what most technology lay people know.
Cemitech was a...
I know that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask an informed question. In Cemitech, help me understand who was the lead and who set the clear goal? Because what I'm noticing is that sounds like something where there was an alignment that took place. Help me understand how that works in transportation.
Let me answer that one. Cemitech actually had 3 different components in it. You had the semiconductor manufacturers, and they had one view. But what we did with Cemitech is we also had something called Cemitech, which was all the U.S. domestic suppliers to the semiconductor industry. That was a different focus. We also looked at the interfaces of what was required to support the semiconductor industry. I was in charge of planning technology transfer there. I was on the startup team. I led the first semiconductor roadmap.
What was the impetus for it in the first place? It was to help ensure and protect our homeland,
The
right?
U.S. invented the semiconductor industry. At the time we formed Cemitech, the U.S. domestic percentage of the semiconductor industry had fallen to 35%. We cannot protect our country, we cannot protect our industries if we do not control the capability to bring that intelligence into the process.
So we had something that was greater than every other human in the United States.
One of my groups produced the video that we distributed across Congress. I mean, we had congressmen with tears in their eyes when they saw the impact on their children's children. If we had not recovered the semiconductor industry today, and I'm a professional futurist, our impact today would be much worse than where we are today. And that's why the new congressional action to go back and go to the next generation of semiconductors is there. We've hit the point where Moore's Law has been redefined. And there's 3 actual parts of Moore's Law. It has been redefined. And we do not own the most advanced fabs anymore. The most advanced fabs are overseas. That's right. And we cannot produce our most advanced weapon systems, for example, or the most advanced autonomous, gearing towards level 4 autonomous vehicle with domestic chips. We can't do it. So we don't control the raw material. So again, just going through this, you can see it's a multiple system of systems problem you got to solve. And what MCC and Cemitech were good at is they allowed pre-competitive research.
So
what group intelligence.
What we need is the alignment then, because still, as I mentioned today, like last year, 42,157 people died. That's a Boeing 747. I think that might get a few congressmen teary-eyed, or it should. Right?
We have one more comment back here, which I'm going to allow. I know we're already late, but we have this real quick, and then we're done.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about verification. So in the mid-90s, I worked on a DARPA-funded project using one of the first digital, it was a digital equipment, first gigahertz processor, and Digital Equipment Corp gave us a C model of their entire processor. We simulated every bus transaction on that C model. Circuit boards came and just worked. So today, we're now calling it digital twin, but you have to create a model of not only the processor, the system, the network, and this is critical for security, because you have to continually test that model in a vacuum and find vulnerabilities, find faults, and so on. There's absolutely no way that we can evolve with the complexity we have without building models, different complexities, and building out test environments so that as things are deployed, we are still testing and looking for vulnerabilities. So we've been doing this for a long time. It's evolved, but it's been happening for decades.
I will go on record and say that, yes, digital twins are useful.
Well, on that note, I think we've exceeded our time a little bit. We didn't get to subterranean, I'm sorry, but you can catch Darren after this. Ask him anything you want about it. He's so knowledgeable about this. It's incredible. Sorry, I told you I was going to set you up. And on that, can we give it up for this panel? I mean, we covered everything.